Only have 3 of us at the moment.
I hope not.
I think they're allowing people into the meeting as we speak, so we'll start to see other faces.
Go ahead. With only 4 of us? Yes, correct. Okay, all right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deborah Lockwood. Today is December 4th, 2024, and today's meeting of the Planning Commission is called to order. May we have our roll call, please?
Yes, Commissioner Fry.
Present.
Commissioner Kaiser did say that he was going to be absent today. Commissioner Monte Blanco.
Here.
Commissioner Rosenberry.
Present.
Commissioner Whips. Looks like he's on, but I don't see him. But he did say he was going to be present.
I'm present. Can you hear me now?
Okay, yes, we can. Thank
All
you.
right, I think someone had me on mute. Thank you.
Commissioner Will.
Present.
Okay. Vice Chair Maury Bidu.
Present.
Chair Lockwood.
Present.
Okay, we have 7 planning commissioners present. We do have a quorum.
Thank you. Director's report, please.
Thank you, Chair Lockwood. My name is Erin Wardell, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Department of Land Use and Transportation. I'm going to start with a very exciting announcement, which is that we have a new Planning and Development Services Manager, Carol Johnson, who's here with me. And I'd actually like to turn it over to Carol to introduce herself a little bit more thoroughly. She just started last week, so at some time in January or February, Carol will take over with the delegated authority of the Director and sit in this seat for future Planning Commission meetings. So, introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to meet you all this afternoon. And my name's Carol Johnson, and my most recent experience in the area was serving the role of the Land Use and Planning Director for Multnomah County. So have some regional experience, although quite different geographically and demographically from Washington County. So I know I've got a lot to learn, but I'm thrilled to be here and be a part of this great organization, and it'll be my pleasure to serve the commission. Thank you.
We're so happy to have Carol on board. So we are currently recruiting for 2 vacancies for the Planning Commission, and so if you know people in your network who would be great applicants, please encourage them to apply. We will be presenting to the board in work session on December 17th, and so it would be ideal to have those applications in as soon as possible so we can do interviews and share those with the board. Chair Lockwood's term will end at the end of January, and so we are planning on having both of our, hopefully, new planning commissioners installed before then so they can start in the February meetings. At your February 5th meeting, that would be ideal for the PC to elect and install a chair and a vice chair. So another thing to keep in mind is if you are interested in either of those roles or would like to nominate someone else for those roles, that'll be something that happens in early February. So in other news, we have an upcoming open house for the Farmington Road Concept Plan. That workshop will be from 5 to 7 p.m. at Butternut Creek Elementary School. The Farmington Road Concept Plan project is intended to be a visioning project to guide future design and construction of improvements on Farmington Road and to facilitate a jurisdictional transfer from the state of Oregon to Washington County. So it's a really important project to that community, and we're looking forward to sharing it at that open house. For your meeting today, we have 3 work sessions, one relating to state rulemaking on housing, one about the upcoming state legislative agenda, and then a refresher on public meetings law. For your upcoming meetings, we are planning on canceling December 18th. We were planning on having a work session with City of North Plains staff to talk about their UGB planning project, but they've asked us to postpone that, so we'll look to bring them back early next year. And then for January 1st, we're assuming the Planning Commission would like to cancel that meeting as well. I think you probably all have holiday plans, so we're looking at our first meeting in 2025 will be on January 15th at 6:30 p.m., and that concludes the director's report.
Thank you. Are there any questions? No, I don't see any, so thank you. Next item on the agenda is public communication.
Yes, Chair Lockwood, we have 0 people signed up for public communication. Would anyone else in attendance in the audience today or in the virtual audience like to communicate to the Planning Commission on non-agenda items? If so, please indicate by raising your virtual hand. Seeing nobody, we can move on.
Thank you. Now we move to our work sessions, and our first one is on state rulemaking related to housing.
Teresa, Community Planner. This is a topic that the Planning Commission over the next couple of years probably will hear more and more of. So we thought it would be good to have Ann Kelly, who's been serving on the Rulemaking Committee, give a briefing at this time. So I'll turn it over to Ann.
Thank you. I'm Ann Kelly, Senior Planner in Community Planning. And I'm here today to discuss the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis and its rulemaking. Next slide, please.
Oh, you do it.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'll do it.
Great.
I'll try to do it.
Thank you. The Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, well, look at the overview here. The Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, we'll talk about what it is, its purpose as intended by the state, the rulemaking basics, some discussion of advisory committees and rulemaking roles, the requirements of the ONA, and what to expect as the Planning Commission. Thank you. So the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis is a new set of state laws that affects statewide Planning Goal 10 related to housing and Planning Goal 14 related to urbanization. It comes in response to this ongoing statewide housing crisis, and it expands how the state, regional, and local governments address our housing work, our planning for housing, from a narrow focus on land capacity to actions that promote housing production, affordability, and choice. It affects cities over 10,000 in population and metro counties, and it requires jurisdiction-specific qualitative and qualitative analyses that are hyperlocal. We look at housing need tied to location, housing type, and very specific characteristics like accessibility and affordability ranges and other features. The analyses also have to be examined through affirmatively furthering fair housing, a mandate, and a restorative justice lens. Local strategies and actions then have to respond to our findings of these analyses. The state has a number of intentions tied to the ONA, and these are just some of them. They're looking to ensure efficient use of buildable land for adequate numbers of needed housing, housing choice for all in areas where they want to live, housing that's safe, accessible, and affordable, fair housing, climate considerations and environmental justice, more certainty in the development process to reduce housing costs, and they're looking to set up an evaluation framework and a way to track progress. The onus stems from House Bill 2001 in 2023 and a number of other bills dating back to 2019. Oregon administrative rules that are being produced as part of the rulemaking process are state directives, regulations, and standards that implement or interpret the law, and Oregon administrative rules have the force of law. So per House Bill 2001, the Land Conservation and Development Commission has to adopt rules in 3 key topic areas for ONA, and those include housing needs and production, housing accountability, and those 2 things will be before the Land Conservation and Development Commission tomorrow for a vote on the rules. The 3rd area is housing capacity and urbanization, and rules for that topic will be developed next year, have to be adopted by January 1, 2026, after the further rulemaking continues. The Department of Land Conservation and Development is drafting these rules, doing the rulemaking with input from advisory committees. Next slide. There is a rulemaking advisory committee, which is made up of 45 people from around the state with diverse backgrounds in housing, environmental issues, community involvement, and is represented by local, regional, state staff members and nonprofits and so forth. There are 3 technical advisory committees, one for each of the focus areas of the rulemaking. Next slide, please. This slide shows the communication structure for rulemaking, how DLCD communicates with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. It's 3 technical advisory committees. You can see there's one for housing needs and production, one for housing accountability, and one for capacity and urbanization. Meanwhile, DLCD is also communicating with the governor's office, and ultimately the goal is adoption by the Land Conservation and Development Commission. Next slide, please. Oh, sure. Washington County is represented by at least 2 members on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. I'm one of them, and Rachel Moribidu is another. Requirements of the rules expand responsibilities for cities and newly apply responsibilities to metro counties for our unincorporated urban lands. Where we previously thought about housing planning from just a housing capacity perspective, we are now looking at analysis of something called contextualized housing need, which in fact has a number of sub-analyses tied to it, and fair housing issue area analyses to look at all the geographies in the county as to past harms and restorative justice for those, and very specific housing needs by location. We also need to provide a housing production strategy. It's due 1 year after each housing capacity analysis is adopted, every 6 years. The housing production strategy has to include actions that drive production of housing that we've deemed necessary through our analyses. Next slide, please. One key aspect of the housing capacity analysis is the contextualized housing need. It's an analysis in itself, and it calls for multi-departmental engagement with specific groups, including these noted here: protected classes, tribal communities, all races and ethnicities, those with disabilities, experiencing homeless, and others in disparate housing conditions. So we will be doing robust engagement as part of the ONA. We also have to identify and inventory barriers to needed housing. We need to look at numerous forms of data related to homelessness and housing, looking at past land use and housing discriminatory actions and how these have impacted specific geographies, which we then need to map. And again, we'll be identifying specific housing types, characteristics, and locations for housing that we deem necessary by location. Next slide, please. Another part of the contextualized housing need analysis is a fair housing issue area analysis. And for this, we're looking at choice and fair access to housing for specifically for the groups that I previously noted as part of engagement requirements. We're looking at patterns of segregation, affluence, and poverty, mitigation of exposure to harms, and choices for rental ownership, wealth building, and access to community assets. We're also looking at housing stability issues. Next slide, please. The housing production strategy, another major deliverable, comes as a result of those prior mentioned analyses. And it is a list of specific actions to address the need that we identify throughout the various parts of unincorporated urban Washington County. So we'll be proposing actions to produce or achieve the types of housing that we need for the groups that we need and at the price ranges and in the locations that we need. This will be coupled with affirmatively furthering fair housing, including mitigation of identified past harms. And over time, we'll need to demonstrate the efficacy of these actions that we propose. This slide shows the primary aspects of the ONA process, and the yellow highlighted actions indicate departures from a past housing planning focus on land capacity. You'll see there the determination of housing type, characteristics, and location. We do get an overall allocation of need for unincorporated Washington County at various price and rent brackets from the state via work with Metro. But then we do have to break that down to be very hyper-local at the county level. We're also looking at then promoting needed housing, accommodating that needed housing, and affirmatively furthering fair housing, Then there is a reporting and evaluation component. And next slide, please. We are held accountable for local outcomes. There is some state understanding that not everything is within our control. But for local jurisdictions that are found to be underperforming, there is what's called an acceleration process. And it involves state analysis of barriers to our intended housing outcomes and proposed planning and funding assistance from the state to increase local success rates.
When does Washington County get evaluated for how they're coming along on these? And I mean, is that
there is not
every
yet.
so often, or how does that work?
Yes, every so often. There's not yet an initial deadline for metro counties, it should be sometime after 2027 that we have to submit our initial housing capacity analysis. And then every 6 years, we will update that. And each year following the housing capacity analysis, of course, comes the housing production strategy. At the midpoint of each cycle, there's sort of a state evaluation of how we're doing. And then at the end of that, again, they'll be evaluating our progress. But if we're found to be significantly underperforming, we may be referred to an acceleration program beginning around that midpoint. So what to expect as the Planning Commission? You'll be seeing eventually that housing capacity analysis with the contextualized housing need, fair housing issue area analysis, and the housing production strategy, which ultimately all will be adopted by the board. That again will be sometime after 2027 when we begin to see those products. But you may see aspects of those, you very likely will see aspects of those in advance in stages, and those would include plan and community development code changes intended to make up actions within our housing production strategy to boost capacity for housing, to lift barriers to housing, and to drive production of the specific housing types and characteristics that we need to see. Beyond that, there's much more to come in rulemaking next year, so you'll be seeing the products required of that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kelly. Commissioners, do you have questions? Commissioner Moy-Bidu. Vice Chair Moy-Bidu.
No question. Great presentation. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that I'm not representing Washington County in my work on the RAC and the NABTEC. And Anna's doing an awesome job representing the county. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Monteblanco.
This is great, thank you. And it's nice to have kind of see what's coming. I'm curious, you mentioned restorative justice. I'm curious how that's defined and how that's come up in the rulemaking.
I don't have the actual definition from the latest draft rules with me at the moment, but they were very recently published, and that definition, I believe, is in what's to be considered tomorrow by the Land Conservation and Development Commission. But the rules are looking at researching, analyzing, and mapping geographies where past harms have occurred, and also outreach to communities that were harmed, and then determining specific needs of those groups in those areas and planning for housing to meet those needs. Does that cover a bit of what you're thinking?
Yeah, I was curious. It's just, I mean, I don't have any expertise in that area, but it's certainly a word that a term and something that's used quite a bit in relation to some of my work. And I imagine it was a robust conversation about what that, how that should be defined. So I'll be curious to ultimately hear what ultimately passes. And then can you tell me what a climate-friendly area is?
We have areas mapped in the county. Actually, I believe they're all of the town centers that we've previously identified where we have reduced parking or no parking requirements, right? What else?
Yeah, so in the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules, outside of metro, they're called climate-friendly areas, and they needed to define them here. they are all of the town centers that are in the Metro 2040 plan. So we have areas like Aloha Town Center, Bethany, Raleigh Hills. So they're areas of concentrated higher density development, commercial activity, that sort of thing. We actually, with the CFEC, eliminated the parking requirements everywhere, not just in the town centers now. But yeah, there are the reduced parking, and there'll be some other changes over time that we need to do for the rest of that climate-friendly and equitable communities. But that's what they are, essentially, the town center areas.
Areas where many needs are concentrated in one area, and the trip distances are intended to be less, and multimodal transportation is more possible.
Can I ask one more question?
Oh, yes, please.
Thank you. All this work, your involvement, your expertise, it sounds like a lot. And I'm just curious, is this an example of an unfunded mandate from the state?
Hopefully not. The state does have a lot of language about intended funding and intended planning assistance, consultant provision, state staff assistance. So hopefully that pans out.
But to date, it has been unfunded, and that we are participating quite heavily in the rulemaking. And we do expect that you'll hear some from our government relations folks about things coming up next year, and there probably will be some more housing legislation next year. So we're hopeful that there will be grant funding that will help us implement the requirements, but there's a lot of work in just getting to that point where the rulemaking is done and we can implement. And we've spent a lot of time trying to understand and kind of affect what the rules end up being.
Yes, and I should mention we have gotten a few grants from the state already toward facilitating housing, changing some code standards to lift barriers, and those are upcoming.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Vice Chair Maury Bidu.
Thanks, Chair Lockwood. Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. There are some items in the governor's proposed budget that relate to providing funding in certain areas related to the ONA and particularly the acceleration program, and some funding availability for consultants. So nothing established yet. And I guess we'll see what happens with the budget, but there are some items, some budgeted money set aside for this work.
Other commissioners? I have a couple of questions. You mentioned many terms that are pretty general, and I'm just going to ask about one of them. What does it mean to be affirmatively equitable?
Oh, affirmatively furthering fair housing is one mandate, and then equitable outcomes is just one aspect of affirmatively furthering fair housing. The fair housing mandate is one that we've seen for a long time, but now it's actually paired with our planning of housing across all income brackets and needs. I don't know that I can get very detailed about all of what affirmatively furthering fair housing means today, but overall, we want everyone who needs housing to be able to access it in Washington County where they want to live. And that includes the remedying past harms, providing for accessibility, making sure that people of color are not disadvantaged in terms of their access to housing in the type that they want, where they want to live. It's a very large
Yeah, and so,
lift.
how do you, I'm just wondering, how do you affirm it? How do you get the?
How do you measure it?
Yeah.
Like I said, I think the state has a really long list of intentions for this program, and I think kind of like a mini series, maybe the pilot won't be as good as the later the later episodes. So I think it'll be sort of, our best possible effort in the beginning, and then we'll find better and better ways to measure it.
That sounds realistic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I jump in here too? Do you mind? There's a statutory definition, which is a long list, but it's ORS 197A.025, and basically says that it emphasizes fair housing outcomes, environmental justice, climate mitigation and resilience, and access to opportunity, following the principles of transparency, public engagement, and sustainability. And it goes into more detail in that code.
Thanks.
And we have had a fair housing presentation maybe a little more than a year ago. And as we go further in this, we might want to do that again. The Fair Housing Council was here. They have a really wonderful book that talks more about what fair housing means, and affirmatively furthering it means just taking actual actions to try to increase fair housing. So we can probably set that up over the next year before we end up having to dive a lot more into it.
Yeah, there was one slide that touches on several of those aspects that Commissioner Moribito mentioned.
Any other questions? Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Our next work session is a 2025 legislative agenda for the state.
And I can do a really quick intro so they don't have to do a cold intro. But so Carly and Aaron are our government relations folks, and we asked them to come today to give a bit of a preview of what's coming in the legislative session starting in January, although a lot of work ends up starting way before that. So they've been quite busy now. So with that introduction.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you so much, Teresa. Hi, Chair Lockwood, Commissioners. It's great to be here before you today. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm going to take some time to just touch on a few legislative items, then we'll dig into our 2025 priorities. So first off, many of you are aware of the structure of legislative sessions, but just for awareness, I did want to flag that the legislative sessions are an opportunity for members of the Oregon State Legislature to convene and make policy and budgetary decisions on behalf of Oregonians in collaboration with the governor and executive branch agencies. There are several different types of legislative sessions, both special, short, and long. We did just hear that the governor is called a special session regarding wildfire funding specifically. Last year, or excuse me, it is still 24. This year we did have a short session which spanned most of February, and then 25 we're getting ready to head into the long session, which begins on January 22nd and will be about a 160-day sprint that we are looking forward to running through the finish line tape on. Also, the legislative chamber is composed of 60 members of the House and 30 members of the Senate, both of which this next session the Democrats do have control of, so we'll see how that works out in terms of policy. Just a quick overview on the Oregon state budget. A flag is that the biennial budget is adopted in odd years during the long session, so we are headed into a budget year, which is going to amount to a lot of excitement and also a lot of work, but also a lot of opportunity to bring home resources to the county that the team and I are really excited about. The budget year does begin on July 1st, and adjustments to the budget year can be made in the following short or special session. And then just a few things on the revenue supporting the state budget. I wanted to just flag the general fund, which is composed of revenue from income taxes paid by individuals and businesses, makes up a vast majority of the general fund. Legislators have significantly more discretion in deciding how the general funds are appropriated compared to other revenue sources. And the general fund is largely used to pay for agencies that do not produce revenues or rely on federal appropriations. There is significant competition for these dollars among stakeholders.
And if I may, this is where DLCD's funding comes out of the general fund. They do not charge fees. Sorry. The DLCD budget comes out of that general fund bucket. So when we ask for support for the new mandates related to land use that you just heard about through the rulemaking, it is expected, if any funding would come to us, it would also come out of that general fund. But DLCD is part of the natural resources budget, which comprises of approximately 3% of the overall state budget for all 13 departments that fit under natural resources. So the chances of funding mandates in land use are hard to come by in that general fund.
Thank you for that, Erin. And then we also like to call out the Oregon Lottery Fund, which there's often a lot of public misinformation about where those dollars are allocated. But it is revenue through the lottery entertainment sales and pays for the operation, including prizes for winners. But then all of the remaining profit goes to the state of Oregon. Historically, legislators have had notable discretion deciding how these funds are appropriated compared to other revenue sources, but over time, this has shifted so that a greater percentage of funding is dedicated to specific supported services, including economic development, K through 12 education, parks, natural resources, veterans, and job creation, among other things. And I also like to just highlight that the other funds category includes money gathered from state agencies through services and licensing. Now we're going to get into the fun stuff, the state legislative agenda. Just an overview, the process for developing our legislative agenda is fairly intensive and often builds off of the work of previous legislative sessions and in response to legislative actions and executive actions. The government relations teams works with subject matters across the county to identify areas of need within the county's priorities, and that can be addressed with a legislative solution. We weigh the political and legislative realities when developing our proposals for the legislative session and present the work product in work sessions before the Board of County Commissioners. After several rounds of thoughtful feedback from the board, we finalized a robust 2025 legislative agenda that my colleagues and I look forward to implementing in policy next session. I do want to flag that there is a large amount of work that the team works on that does impact policy that isn't necessarily explicitly detailed in our legislative agenda. This really ranges from a wide range of issues such as housing and housing production strategies, such as what Anne and Teresa just presented on, to work on the 2025 transportation package, to identifying underfunded and unfunded mandates that need to be addressed. So what is detailed in the coming slides really represents, I would say, the top priorities the team will be carrying out, but there is a large body of work that we still impact that we'll be championing. So this first slide touches on our focus of securing stabilized and sustainable funding for services that the state requires the county to provide, AKA no unfunded mandates, please. I also want to call out that we currently are facing about a $20 million budget gap this year here in Washington County. So we need to see strong continued investments by the state for the services that the state requires the county to provide in order to fulfill the policy objectives that the legislature has put in place. Critical services like community corrections, assessment and taxation, operations, our law library, they all desperately need funding to be sustainable and successful in supporting the needs of our communities. Continuing to build off of that, We are really dedicated to procuring funding to support individuals with substance use disorder by sustaining or expanding access to equitable treatment across the continuation of care. Access to substance use disorder treatment and community services are critical priorities for the county, and as we look towards the future, we are very concerned that the current funding formula used to distribute Measure 110 dollars and deflection funds is not sufficient to meet the needs here in Washington County. We strongly support all policies that have been established by the defection program, but our team is going to do our best to implement programs that really look towards the funding structure and ensuring that it is equitable and meets the needs here in the county.
We thought I should talk for a moment. We have had a continuing priority over the last couple of years and couple of legislative sessions to make sure that we are able to recruit and retain the talent necessary for our community to thrive, both internally and externally, so across all businesses. One of the places where we've done a lot of focus has been in the behavioral health arena. We are building out a system to create that continuum of care that Carly discussed in substance use disorder treatment. But it's not just behavioral health workforce needs that we have. We need really good planners in the state capable of doing the work that the DLCD continuously mandates for us to do. We have a great team here. We'd like to be able to continue to have the resources of those folks. So looking at how we can support policies that enhance and grow the population that can fulfill those county staffing needs across all departments, but also creating pathways into Oregon for folks who are licensed in other jurisdictions, other states. Often they run into a barrier of having to do years of work in order to come here, which makes it us less competitive as a hiring state. So we're trying to break down those barriers. These are policy choices that the state can make that we are working towards solution on so that we can recruit faster and continue to grow the workforce here, both from recruiting from other places, but growing our own workforce from the folks who live here. So we're looking at both the investments that the state can make into education, but also the tools that we can make ourselves competitive with, both for the county, but across the state in the private sector as well, and the nonprofit sector. With that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Erin. This next priority is in the housing space, and it is really focused on ensuring that residents in Washington County have access to reliable, safe, and secure affordable housing, which is a top priority of the board. In the next 5 years here in Washington County, we are going to have 569 affordable housing units. And I apologize, I see I have a typo on the slide. That 229 should be 569. So again, that's 569 affordable housing units that are currently set with affordable housing regulations capping the rent on those units that are set to expire. So the regulations capping those costs will expire, which will disproportionately impact vulnerable members of our community. So there is a big focus in the state to develop a dedicated legislative funding source that will help housing providers purchase these buildings to ensure that we can maintain that affordable housing stock. And then secondly, provide funding sources to provide rent assistance for members of the community who might be facing expiration. This next priority is one that we are very excited about, and hopefully we will be getting it across the finish line. But this priority is focused on advancing legislation that will modernize the process for annexation of 100% consent-based special district annexations, which will allow the county to increase responsiveness and reduce approval timelines for property owners. Currently, when an individual comes forward with an annexation petition that meets the 100% consent-based approval, LUT staff are required under current statute to hold a public hearing that the board oversees, and we have found that it takes about 6 hours of staff time, equating to $850 that because it is a no-cost system, that $850 is paid by the petitioner. So it would not only save staff time here, but result in savings for the public. Furthermore, we have found that in about the past decade of information that we have access to, when we have these hearings, presenting the annexation petition before the board and providing the public the opportunity to testify, they're not being utilized by the public. We only have one instance in which someone has participated in these petitions, in the hearings, to speak about the petition. So, frankly, this is something that really will allow us to modernize the process, to preserve staff time, and to really be responsive to the petitioners, because we will be reducing that time for the approval to be provided. Frankly, it's just a common sense fix that we are looking forward to advancing.
And then the final of our legislative priorities, which, as Carly stated, are where we will focus the forefront of GR responsiveness, but with the 3,000 approximate bills, we'll be thinking about all the other things the legislature thinks about. But in this one, we are looking to replace a funding source that has been diminished based on the actions of the state. So you might not be aware, but a long time ago, almost 80 years ago, there was some lands that were turned over from private ownership into county ownership due to significant wildfires, losing any sort of economic advantage to those lands. And so the landowners just abandoned them, and we received them for delinquent taxes. Over time, a number of counties determined it was more efficient to turn them over for resource management by the state through the state forestry, the Department of Forestry, for purposes of receiving the highest maximum value out of those lands, which we support as timber collection, habitat, and recreational opportunities. Recently, the state decided to pursue a habitat conservation plan through the federal system, by which we become, our plan is in place for the next 50 years so that we are less likely to face litigation related to the Endangered Species Acts for any incidental takings due to harvest within those lands. This resulting in a significant reduction in the harvest in those lands, which does have an impact on Washington County because we receive revenues from those harvest proceeds. As a result, it's not just Washington County's budget that's affected within Washington County. There's a number of school districts and fire districts that will see a revenue shortfall due to these changes under the Habitat Conservation Plan, and we are now working to, in conjunction with those taxing districts as well as the state, to determine if there is a process by which we can be reimbursed for those that policy choice to have that Habitat Conservation Plan in place. It's tough because every budget cycle looks at a lot of competing interests, but we do believe this serves the purposes and some of the key focuses of the legislature related to funding sources for education, which are the largest recipients of those timber revenues. Washington County is joining with the other impacted state trust land counties to try and find a solution that works for all of us. So while it's a small portion of our budget, every dollar counts when you're looking at a $20 million shortfall. With that, I'll turn it back.
Thank you, Erin. In this closing section, we're going to touch on capital improvement projects here within the county that the government relations team has worked with the county board to identify that we would like to move forward in terms of funding asks before the state legislature in the end of session budget bill, otherwise known as the Christmas tree bill. So we have prioritized 4 of the projects contained within the capital improvement plan, and we will be working to secure funding for all 4, but do have some priorities. One of which is securing additional funds for the courthouse replacement project, which is an ongoing priority of the county. There is a lot at stake regarding this project. Washington County is the second most populous county in Oregon, and is not only is the current courthouse too small to meet the needs of our growing community, it also is seismically unsafe. The goal is to plan for a modern, safety-compliant, and trauma-informed facility with enough courtrooms, judges, and staff to allow for timely access to justice across our county. There are seismic vulnerabilities, limited space for judges, staff, and courtrooms, significant lack of access for people with disabilities, and lack of trauma-informed spaces for those who may have difficult court cases. So the team and I plan to advance an ask to the legislature of appropriating $1.25 million in matching state funds for the planning and replacement of the historic courthouse, which is only 100 years old. The next, oh yes, Chair.
Would that be at the same location, or it could be at a different location?
The planning process will make that determination.
Okay,
So
so
if we receive the funding in this year, we'll have $2.5 million in which to do a complete assessment of the current value of the space. If it can be replaced on that footprint, what we would do if we are trying to both demolish and, because we assume the assessment will determine that it is not simply renovatable. So all of those pieces would be part of the planning process that would take place as soon as we get the state's match in place.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next project that I want to highlight is the Scoggins Creek Visitor Center, which is located at Scoggins Valley Park and is managed by the county on behalf of the Bureau of Reclamation. The park presents many outdoor recreation opportunities for the local community, including boating, paddling, fishing, swimming, hiking, biking, disc golfing, picnicking, wildlife viewing, and more. The Visitor Center would provide community gathering space and house administrative functions. Given ongoing safety concerns at the park, the center would also offer an opportunity to provide education and resources that would improve safety for visitors. The current facility is a manufacturer home that is at the end of its life and cannot meet the growing demand of the public. So the county will be moving forward with an ask of $1.7 million, which will be a match that we have received from a grant from the Bureau of Reclamation. But it does require a dollar-for-dollar match to move forward with that federal fund. So we are optimistic that the legislature will see the value of that project. Another one that is incredibly important is the Walnut Street Center, which houses the operations and maintenance division of our LUT department and a lot of other components there. In the event of an earthquake, the Walnut Street Center facility is at significant risk of collapse. It houses 3 departments that would be critical for emergency response, including the emergency management, as I mentioned, land use and transportation, and our fleet. If EM, LUT, or the fleet staff are injured or displaced, the coordination of disaster response efforts could be severely disrupted, impacting the entire community. In addition, a significant part of our emergency response and public safety fleet is housed in this facility. If our vehicles are damaged, we would face additional challenges in delivering the services in the aftermath of a major seismic event. LUT also has a system in this facility for controlling traffic lights, which would create significant safety issues if damaged. The facility is also in need of an HVAC upgrade, and at this point in time, staff is still working on refining design and other cost efforts. But the current estimated price tag for this project is $20.2 million, but could be adjusted based on the improvements that we include in the ask. So it is a larger price tag. However, there are so many compelling reasons for the legislature to invest in this project. And then the final one is the West Side Commons Fair Complex. We have conducted, I believe, the first phase 1A of the Washington Fair Complex. So this ask focuses on phase 1B, which is directly anchored in community priorities thanks to the approximately 3,800 county residents who took part in a survey to help shape the direction of the fairgrounds and prioritize projects that would support and benefit the 4-H horse and livestock programs, the greater agricultural community, and also during times of emergency evacuation, such as when livestock need a place to go during wildfires. The projects included within Phase 1B are construction of a new barn and multi-purpose facility to house horse and livestock programs for 4-H, the construction of outdoor horse and riding and livestock show arena, and additional site work and the removal of old barns. So the funding ask for that project is $15 million. And again, I think is a great way for the legislature to show their investment in this local community. And at that concludes our slides. So I'll turn it back over to you, Chair Lockwood, to guide any conversation. Thank you.
Commissioner Will.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. I just was curious, historically, are there any asks that we didn't get in the past, excuse me, that are carrying over now that we're asking again? And also, on your agenda, are there things that, you know, that you don't, do you expect to get all of your agenda done? Just anticipation for the community. It's very, great list of agenda, but I'm curious, what's the likelihood that we get everything we ask for?
I've never gotten everything I've asked for out of the legislature in my 12 years of working with them. So I don't expect that record will change this year because we have a really robust and really aggressive agenda set by our board. Some of these are fairly consistent asks that we've come back to the legislature for investment and reinvestment, particularly as it relates to sustainable funding for those shared programs or mandates. Community corrections is one that we've been working on for the 5 years that I've been working the legislative agendas here in Washington County. We are inching closer every year. And we have a new cost study that will help us in that effort to right size the amount of funding that comes out of the legislature for those types of services. This is the third year we'll be asking for courthouse money. We do think we're closer to the top of the list this year. We do think we have a lot of momentum with our delegation to really push that ask over that threshold this year, which is very exciting for us and for the community. Annexation bills, I think we can do it in 1 year, but it's very rare that we can mess with the annexation system and not have people raise concerns, but I've done it once. I believe Carly will do it this time. I do think that a lot of this is dependent upon how the legislature decides to prioritize between their key priorities, which have surrounded education, housing, transportation package, and behavioral health and substance use disorder. I think because we do align, we will see continued success in those areas. For example, we have gotten the final leg of, or the final tranche of funding out of the state legislature for our Centers for Addiction Triage and Treatment over the last 2 sessions, and those are now poised to be open in 2025, which is very exciting. We do have a lot of collaboration built up with other partners related to workforce, but some of these are just incremental improvements year over year, and once we have them in place, we go on to the next version or next step in the process. But I do think that because there is so much alignment, we will have success. Where we always wonder is the capital projects. How much money is actually going to be available at the end of the year to put into the ornaments on the Christmas tree bill? We do think that our delegation is open and willing to work with us to really push that, and given that we have a sizable portion of these 60 House members and 30 senators that represent some or all of their district in Washington County, we do believe we can be successful in that. But no, I don't think we'll be 100% successful because unfunded mandates show up every year, and that's where we spend a lot of our time with 3,000 other pieces of legislation that will come forward, including the entire state's biennial budget. Sometimes they get distracted from our priorities.
One quick follow-up, like on the county fairgrounds, the phase 1B there, like did 1A get funded last time, or are we asking for 1B again now, and because it didn't get refunded last time?
Phase 1A was not paid for by the state. We have not ever made a fairground ask specifically related to our fairground master plan. So this is the first time we're bringing it to the legislature. Our board is the one that found the funding for phase 1A, and now we are turning to seek the assistance of the legislature. Fairgrounds is an area where we often see investments made in other counties, and we have not been asking, so they haven't known to give us the money. So this year, in working with our board and our leadership, said we should ask at a minimum.
Yeah, that's great, because like you mentioned how if there's a fire, animals might be brought to our fairgrounds, and that's kind of a state issue. Fires don't follow jurisdictional boundaries. So I wish you guys luck with this agenda. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, we have used the fairgrounds in the last 2 years, not just for our community, but for neighboring counties. When smoke travels, it travels far, and that's often what we're trying to protect some of the livestock from. But we make homes for folks who are also seeking shelter for their livestock in Clackamas County when their fairgrounds cannot be safe. So it's an important piece of the state's needs.
Vice Chair Morabito.
Thank you for all of your hard work and for this presentation. I was wondering if you could go into the affordable housing proposal a little bit more. What kind of a little bit more information on what the proposal is? Is it a grant system? Is it funding through Oregon Housing and Community Services, or is it more specific to Washington County and how it would deploy?
Thank you for that question, Vice Chair. A lot of that is still being sorted out. It will not be a grant program. It will be a funding mechanism, likely through OHCS, but there will be two tranches of money. Again, one focused on purchasing those buildings so we can preserve them, and another focused on that tenant preservation and providing the funding in the instance that those rents do increase. In looking at the numbers that are being proposed, we do know that statewide, not all units will be able to be preserved, so there will be a focus on trying to identify the buildings that really house the most vulnerable members of our communities, the ones that will have the hardest time finding other affordable housing options. So the whole coalition of housing partners is really taking a close look and thoughtful look at how to implement something of this size, because it is a substantial amount of money. And again, there is going to be a lot of competition among jurisdictions. So we will have more information forthcoming, and happy to follow up with you all as more information is shared from those work groups.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Not seeing any, so thank you both very much.
Thank you so much.
So we've heard a lot in the past hour, and I'm suggesting that we have a 5-minute break before our final work session. So if there's no objection, we'll take a 5-minute break at this time. I need more of that in my life. It's not a bad thing.
All right.
Thank you, everybody, for coming back and getting in your places. And I think we're ready now for Mr. Bovet's presentation, his refresher on public meeting law.
Well, good afternoon, Chair Lockwood and Commissioners. For the record, I'm Rob Bovet with the County Counsel's office here in Washington County, and I am your Planning Commission lawyer, for better or for worse. My purpose here today is just to give you not necessarily a refresher, although it will be a partial refresher. We actually have some new laws and new rules that went into effect very recently to address one aspect of public meetings law that I would like to kind of remind everybody of, because now they have extra oomph behind them in terms of their ability to be enforced against individuals and boards and commissions. And those all relate to serial communications, which I'll describe here in a minute. The two primary changes I'm going to talk about are the changes to serial communications and what the legislature did, as well as the Ethics Commission by rules that went into effect a couple months ago, as well as the new enforcement powers that the Ethics Commission has to enforce the things I'm going to talk about, which I thought was important enough to come talk to you about. So with that, I'll just kind of get started here and advance to the first slide. I've really got to start really with the basics of public meetings law and to distinguish public meetings law from other laws that are similar but often confused. So what public meetings laws are basically about here in Oregon is sunshine. It's about making sure that public boards and commissions and task forces that are doing the public's business all do it in the open. Nothing secret, nothing behind closed doors. This all came about in 1973. You can think of what was going on at that time, the whole Watergate business. That's when we got our core public meetings law and public records law as well. And this is all about just making sure that people are provided, the citizens are provided adequate notice and an opportunity to attend and observe public boards and commissions as they engage in the decision-making process, both discussions and deliberations, as well as the actual decisions that are made. And I distinguish the public meetings law from public hearings. Public hearings are also public meetings, but that's just a subset of public meetings. Public hearings are when the public has a right to essentially testify and provide input into decision-making bodies. Public meetings applies even more broadly. That applies to after you've already heard the input and now you're talking among yourselves, deliberating and making a decision. Public meetings law applies. And public meetings law applies to, generally speaking, all governing bodies of all public bodies. Now, those are two phrases used in 1973. They're not exactly precise, but as defined, they basically mean everything I've described here, including you. It applies to both advisory bodies and decision-making bodies, and you actually wear both hats. When it comes to ordinances, for example, only the Washington County Board of Commissioners can legally enact an ordinance, but you advise them. And so you're an advisory board. The public meetings law applies to you as you do that work. You're also, in some cases, the final county decision maker on some quasi-judicial land use matters. And of course, that's, in those cases, you're a decision maker and the public meetings law applies to you there as well. And so the public meetings law is really about providing notice and an opportunity to observe. There are only limited exceptions, and the limited exceptions are only for discussion and deliberations, not for decisions. All decisions have to be made in public. But there are 16 exceptions that allow for truly behind closed doors discussions and deliberations. We call those executive sessions. There's only 16 of them, and they're very narrow, they're very limited, and they're very specific for purposes usually related to litigation, security, something that really just can't be discussed openly, although the decisions have to be made publicly. About 12 of those 16s apply to local government, generally speaking, and we have to specifically provide notice. And for all but 2 of those, the media has a right to attend to make sure that we're in compliance and not talking about stuff we shouldn't be talking about in executive session. That's basically how public meetings law works in its fundamental sense. So now I want to talk about serial communications and how this got a little complicated really within the last 10 years, although it really started to get complicated in the early 90s. And I want to talk about serial communications that are both direct and indirect. And I'll give you a couple of hypotheticals which I think will help explain what I mean by serial communications. My first hypothetical is essentially a direct example where essentially we have an email chain among a quorum of commissioners where somebody starts an email and a quorum of your commission or the Board of Commissioners or whoever it is copied in. And the discussion in that email is of substance, not of what time are we meeting or where is lunch. We're talking about actual business of the commission. And then somebody else replies, and somebody else replies, and somebody else replies. You can see essentially discussions and deliberations are being conducted through serial email chains. Now, in 1973, of course, email didn't exist. So there is a reason why we encourage all of our staff here at Washington County when communicating with your commission or our Board of Commissioners or any board or commission to put everybody in the blind copy, the BCC, even when we're discussing a procedural matter such as when's the commission going to meet, non-substantive things. And the reason for that is to avoid that reply to all button, because that can easily just stray into a violation of public meetings law where somebody's talking about something of substance that could come before the commission inadvertently by a reply to all. So that's why we do that as well. So we need to be aware of direct violations of public meetings law through serial communications by email that include a quorum of a commission. There's a second kind, which is indirect, which gets even more amorphous. And that, the hypothetical would be, and I'll just give you a hypothetical. Let's just say a county administrator goes to Commissioner A and says, I'm trying to figure out where you guys are at on issue X. And so where are you at? And Commissioner A tells the county administrator where Commissioner A is at. And then the administrator goes to B and C and D and E and figures out where everybody's at. So far, so good. There's no decision or deliberation or even discussion among a quorum. But what if the commissioner also, when he's visiting each of those 5 in their office, says, hey, and you know what Commissioner A said? And then he goes to Commissioner C. Oh, you know what Commissioners A and B said? Essentially operating through an intermediary. They're having a discussion about a matter that could come before the commission through an intermediary. Now, I say these are both hypotheticals, but they're actually not. They happened in a real live case 10 years ago in Lane County. Both of those hypotheticals happened. I won't get into the details of the case, and the case involved a lot more than just those 2 issues. But that case is important because it went to the Oregon Court of Appeals because, among other things, the Court of Appeals said, guess what? Public meetings law is violated when you do serial communications through an email chain directly, and public meetings law is violated when you have an indirect communication like I just described among, in that case it was a county administrator talking to 5 individual county commissioners. Because you're essentially circumventing the public meetings law that says you have to do these discussions in open public meeting so the public can observe. Now, here's the wrinkle that the legislature just cleaned up, so to speak, 2 years ago. The wrinkle is that case, Handy versus Lane County, got appealed to the Oregon Supreme Court. And the following year, in 2016, the Oregon Supreme Court reversed the Oregon Court of Appeals. But here's the rub, not on those two issues. So under the law, technically, the Handy versus Lane County decision at the Court of Appeals is not necessarily authoritative, but it certainly is advisory. So after the Handy case was decided, local government counsel such as myself advised almost uniformly our clients to abide by the Lane County decision because essentially it was the appellate courts telling us this is how we're going to interpret it. If you do these serial communications by email or through intermediaries, we're going to hold that to be a violation of the public meetings law. And we so advised. Fast forward to a few years ago, and there were a few highly contentious school board actions in a county, remain unnamed, not this county by the way, that involved serial communications of both types that I describe. And it became highly contentious and highly controversial. And the legislature and various folks tried to enforce the public meetings law with respect to those school boards and ran smack dab into the Handy decision, which was advisory only. It wasn't binding law. So there was no clarification that was binding under Oregon law to say, yeah, these are in fact violations. Well, the legislature stepped in, and many legislators basically said, we're going to fix that, we're going to clarify that, we're going to make sure that we update public meetings law to say that serial communications are in fact prohibited under the public meetings law when they involve a quorum of a public body discussing or deliberating a matter that could come before that body. And so what happened was two legislators, actually both from here in Washington County, kind of got assigned to take the lead and try to work this through. They introduced a bill in 2022 right after all this happened and discovered very quickly that public meetings law is a little bit complicated. And there's a lot of wrinkles to it and hadn't been updated since 1973. So instead of trying to fix it in a quick 35-day short session, which is what the 2022 session was, they created a task force to look at it, a work group. And that work group met, and it ultimately resulted in 2023 House Bill 2805, so a bill that was just enacted last year. I was asked to be on that work group because I have a long background in public meetings law, and I represented local government. And bless my colleagues from the Oregon Department of Justice who had ideas about how to codify Handy. They really don't represent a lot of local governments where the wrinkles get very complicated, because if you're not careful, you can dysfunctionalize a local government very quickly if you don't allow them to do the business that they need to do and really be surgical. So believe it or not, they allowed me to craft the bill. So I did craft the bill, sections 1 and 2 of House Bill 2805, which codified the Handy decision as to serial communications, both direct and indirect. The bill also expanded authority of the Ethics Commission to enforce all public meetings law. Previously, they'd only been able to enforce executive session law. Now they have broad authority to write rules and enforce public meetings law. And then the Ethics Commission, of course, set up a Rules Advisory Committee, much like most agencies do, to write rules around public meetings law. The first rules really that have been written since 1973 because they didn't have general rulemaking authority. And the Ethics Commission appointed me to serve on that RAC. We just finished up our work a couple of months ago and essentially fleshed out all the rules around public meetings law. I'm very satisfied with how it came out. There were two minor things I won't mention that have nothing to do with this conversation that I was a little irritated about. I wanted to go my way, but I can't win them all. But generally speaking, I think they're very functional and they work for local government. One of the rules is, of course, related to serial communications, named Serial Communications Prohibited, and it basically further fleshes out the Handy rule, which says if you engage in serial communications, either directly or indirectly, and I've given you two examples of that, involving a quorum of a governing body of a public body, and you are one, then you can violate the public meetings law. And the Ethics Commission now has enforcement authority, and that means authority to not only issue letters of reprimand, but impose fines that can be levied against individuals as well as the entities themselves. So we've come a long way with public meetings law. We've come a long way updating them. I just wanted to come before you and just kind of re-emphasize that with regard to serial communications, we need to be extra careful now and not become an example for the Ethics Commission to start enforcing the brand new rules and statutes. So any email communications, staff is going to be careful, and I urge you to be very careful about copying in any quorum for any discussion really of any matter that might come before this commission. It's best to keep all of those discussions, all of those deliberations in the open and in public where the public can observe all those communications should they so choose. So anyways, that's the short story on why I wanted to come before you, because there's no longer, well, it's not technically good law, but now it is. It's all codified, the Handy decisions. So serial communications among a quorum of governing bodies and public bodies are now prohibited. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Commissioner Rosenberry.
Thank you, Chair. I'm newish. What is our quorum? Are we 50%? Are we 2/3? What's our number?
Your quorum, yeah, your quorum is, well, so we have how many? We have right now, technically, we have 9, so it'd be five at the moment. But if I would, if you want to, how should I say this? It's a slippery slope. Because if you have, for example, a matter that somebody has to conflict out on, or there's a vacancy, I would just encourage you to really not engage in conversations about any matter of substance that might come before the Planning Commission by email. Not discuss or deliberate it. It's the only safe way to be. And then there's also the problem, even if you have it, let's just say between 2 commissioners, and it looks really safe, there's no really chance. What if somebody forwards it to somebody else, you know? And how do you know who somebody else hasn't blind copied in, and then somebody else blind copies somebody new? It's just been email. I mean, emails is great, it's fantastic, but I actually practiced law before email even existed. I remember those times when we actually used to write letters and set them aside for a day. I know it seems archaic, and then look at them the next day before we dropped them in the mail. And now everything is instant. It's just so easy to walk into a public meetings law violation with emails. So if you, my standard advice to all my clients, and it has been even before the Handy decision in 2015, don't use email to discuss public business. It's begging for a slippery slope. Sorry, that was a much longer answer than what you asked.
But it's the right answer. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Commissioner Fry.
Quorum clarification was part of my question because I know our actual group size can vary depending on the week and the meeting. And majority in a quorum, I didn't know what the difference was there. I know we've talked about legislative actions versus our less common quasi-judicial actions. And we've had talks about how much conversation can take place as legislative actions do. There's lobbying and discussion and whatnot that comes into all that. So I suppose it's you're just suggesting that all of that needs to be one-on-one conversation for the most part in verbal versus written, because that's not prohibited.
That's a great question and a great clarifying point. So obviously I'll start with the beginning there. Public meetings law applies to both quasi-judicial hearings and matters and legislative matters as well. So there's no distinction there. The public meetings law applies to both. And really, and I recognize there the legislative matters, there's more opportunity for individual one-offs, more conversations. You think of yourselves as legislators, whereas in quasi-judicial matters, you need to think of yourself more as a judge, where you need to be in a cocoon and not hear anything from anybody. But that's a matter of due process rather than public meetings law. But in either event, Really, what we're talking about here are conversations about substance among and between commissioners. So you may very well, if it's just assuming it's pure legislative matter, have some group come to you, and there's 12 of them, and they want to meet with you, and you agree to meet with them all, and they're all lobbying you to do X, Y, and Z on a truly legislative matter, so it doesn't raise any of the quasi-judicial issues. If it's just you that's in that room, there's not a problem. The problem comes when you share that or when there's more than you and it gets closer to a quorum. So really, the public meetings law really addresses the body itself, the governing body, not individuals who may come to lobby you, if that
But
helps.
even within that, conversations among, in our case, planning commission members, in other cases, whatever it is that, Senate, legislature, whatever we're talking about, there are going to be individual conversations that take place or even smaller group conversations that take place. And it's just watching the quorum that is the real issue there, if I'm understanding correctly. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. It's the quorum that triggers it. But again, if you get, I could come up with a bunch of other hypotheticals that aren't really hypotheticals either, where you're under a quorum and then all of a sudden the conversation leaks to somebody else and then it becomes a quorum through serial communication, because serial means it's in sequence, right? And so it gets back to my lengthy answer to Commissioner Rosenberry, which is it's a slippery slope. And so I just encourage you likewise in personal meetings as well to make sure that so for example, lobbyists typically meet with individual legislators. They don't meet with the committee or a quorum of the committee outside of the public meeting room in a public hearing. And there's a reason for that, because legislators also don't want to violate the public meetings law.
Thank you.
You bet.
Commissioner Will.
That quorum question, I was curious, how does it apply to if we as planning commissioners volunteer on an advisory board, in our capacity as a planning commissioner? Like I was involved recently in an advisory, and I swear there must have been 86, 60 people. I don't know. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Okay, 20 people, from the state, from the county, from the different agencies. Does it apply to these advisory committees that we join?
Potentially. The answer is maybe. If it is truly a governing body of a public body. So, for example, if the governor sets up a task force, and it involves, because these are the big ones I've been on, 21 people from all over the place, and this task force is going to make recommendations to the legislature. That's treated as a public body subject to the public meetings law. It really depends on what they're tasked with doing. If they are advisory to another governing body, such as, and the perfect example is you all. You're on ordinances, you are an advisory commission to the Board of Commissioners on all ordinances that are land use. And you are definitely a public body subject to the public meetings law for all those purposes. So it's hard for me to answer globally, but I can tell you that virtually all of the task forces, commissions, and other advisory boards that I've been appointed to during my 30-plus year career as a county lawyer, they've all been subject to the public meetings law, and I think they've all been noticed and treated as such.
I have two other questions. You mentioned emails are a slippery slope. So as a member of a body, when somebody falls down that slippery slope and emails you and along with 7 other people creating a quorum, the violation was done by the person who sent the email, not the person who received the email? Or how does violations work, and what is the responsibility of us? Because that could happen. You could become part of the slippery slope just by getting copied.
Yeah, indeed you can by getting copied. And really my role is just to try to make sure that doesn't happen and then to cut it off. but really the violation occurred and would occur among those who actually engaged in the discussion. But the violation may not have occurred if they didn't reach a quorum, but once they reached a quorum, even if the other people didn't participate, they didn't participate in the violation. But their being copied in created the violation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So going back to my last question, I remember we had a little session where you gave us some advice on, proper behavior as a planning commissioner before. And one of the things is like somebody has a birthday party, and they become friends with another planning commissioner, and they invite that planning commissioner, and they invite another. And so all of a sudden you have a quorum at a birthday party. So that's not a problem as long as everybody just talks about presents and their ski trip on Saturday and stuff, right?
That's correct. As long as you're not discussing anything that's planning commission business or anything that could potentially come before the planning commission, that's all fine. So that's just fine. If there is something that, for example, commissioners want to discuss, that they want to discuss among quorum or something that might become a quorum, they can always ask the chair to set an agenda item or put it on the meeting agenda. But yeah, you can have a quorum of you all at a party for somebody's going away, even here at the county, and it's all fine.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Not seeing any, so thank you very much.
Not one more.
Commissioner Rosenberry. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned there are 16 exemptions related to executive sessions. Would the Planning Commission ever have to be prepared for one of those?
No, I don't think so. I could dream up some wild hypotheticals where it's possible it would involve personnel type matters, but no, generally speaking, you're not directing, for example, me on litigation issues and things like that, although theoretically it could be possible. But I generally don't see many planning commissions holding executive sessions unless there's something that's gone terribly wrong.
Thank you.
Thank you for your indulgence. Oh, one more question I see.
Commissioner Will.
That led me to my two final little questions. One is if somebody was getting in trouble for a violation and you were copied on the email, is like somebody going to be coming and searching for evidence and be asking us for access to our email accounts? So should we get our own, planning commissioner email so that way when they do come subpoena our email, they don't have to go through our personal emails?
What a great question. That actually does hark back to what I advised you all, a few months ago when I did a presentation on Robert's Rules and general procedure. I would always advise folks to use a separate email for any public business, just to keep that out. There's a reason why I have a personal cell phone and a business cell phone, because one can be subpoenaed and the other really can't. As a matter of public records or public meetings. So yeah, that would always be generally advisable. I guess I wouldn't worry about it too much if you use your personal email address only just to get notice from LUT about meetings and such and communicating directly back with them. The process set up, and I didn't go much into it, is there's a complaint process that is brand new that the Ethics Commission has set up where someone can file a complaint with the Ethics Commission within a certain amount of time of the alleged public meetings law violation. There's an opportunity to cure, or there's a few other things that happen. The Ethics Commission engages in an investigation and decides what to do about it. So there is a formal process now in the rules related to a complaint process. But just as a general matter, I would always advise you to have a separate email address, if you can and if you're willing, for public business versus private business. That way, if anything happens, which is, I don't know if I call it unlikely, but it's not that likely. If anything happens, you really have it segregated and it's separated.
The second thing was, this may sound funny, but so like somebody gets accused of a violation and has to go through an investigation or whatever, because we talk about trying to recruit planning commissioners to replace the open positions. do we get represented by you when we get, or do we have to find our own representation when we get a violation accusation against us?
Well, like any good lawyer, the answer is yes and no. I can't represent you individually, so if there is a violation that you actually committed and they choose to fine you and choose to look at you, I can't represent you. I can represent the Planning Commission and the county. I can essentially file something saying, no, this was all legal because of X, Y, and Z. But if they really are targeting one or two people because they did commit a public meetings law violation, the Ethics Commission has ruled, at least on the ethics side of the law, I can't represent you.
Yeah. I refereed sports, and that became an issue where, like, referees should consider what are their own insurance, as individual people, because the school might get sued or the league may get sued, but the referee might get sued individually.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's interesting to know. Thank you.
You bet. So same outcome, yeah. Well, thank you all for indulging me. I'll probably be back sometime next year with a more general public meetings law refresher to go, and I usually combine it with ethics and public records too, and that takes usually an hour, and I try to do that once every year or two, but maybe you won't have to hear from me between now and then about this topic.
Thank you, Mr. Bovet. Next item on our agenda, announcements. Does any commissioner have an announcement they want to make at this time? I'm not seeing any hands up, so I will make an announcement. We're not going to be meeting again before the holidays, so I just wanted to wish everyone a very nice holiday season and see you next year. Without objection, we are adjourned.
See you next year. Happy holidays.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Bye.